Welcome everybody to today's Seed Saver Series class. Our talk today is going to be harvesting pumpkin seeds and winter squash seeds. This is part of our San Bernardino County Master Gardener Program seed library that we have various locations throughout the county that we're working on developing post-pandemic, and a few locations we used to work with on the east and west end of the valley that are closed now and will probably open in the future. But part of our seed library is also doing seed saving talks and having classes and information sessions where you can learn how to save and grow your own seeds at home. So we're going to jump right in. So we're just going to talk about a few topics today and a few more things than this, but basically we're just going to talk about things to consider and saving the seeds themselves. So there's a couple things to consider, and the first thing to consider is usually the last thing I think of when I'm starting seed saving. So when I see something that's in it like a pea that has dried on the vine, or a fruit that's gotten too ripe, and like a cucumber, and it's not really edible, but the seeds are mature. Or I see a pumpkin and I wonder about the seeds and can I save them? Then really the first question to all of this is, do we know anything about the parents of the seeds? And so usually I come in at the end of the story, not really knowing a lot about the parents, but then it becomes my first question. And so the question is, do you know anything about the parents of the plant you want to seed save from? So today we're talking about pumpkins and winter squash. And so if you've got that pumpkin, or that winter squash, do you know anything about the parents? And what this has to do with is it going to what we call breed true or be true to type? And basically the terms breed true or true to type just mean when you plant that seed, is it going to grow a fruit that's going to match the parents? So for example, when you eat citrus off of the citrus, like, your orange tree, you eat a navel orange, that orange tree is always going to produce the same type of orange unless some sort of mutation has occurred on the branch, which does occasionally happen. But assuming that doesn't happen, then that orange is going to always taste like the orange of the tree. But the seeds inside of that orange could be cross-pollinated with another type of orange, and it's not necessarily a guarantee that that navel orange seed is going to grow a navel orange that looks like the parent. So here we have the peas, the yellow the purple or violet flowers and the white flowers. In high school, I think it was, when you learn about Mendel's the pea experiments and genetics, then you have the two parents. You have a purple pea or violet pea and a white pea. And when you crossbreed or hybridize them, then you're going to get a purple or violet flower because that purple trait is dominant. So the same thing is true with people, and you have blue eyes and brown eyes. Brown eyes is a dominant characteristic. So if one parent has blue eyes and one parent has brown eyes, the brown eye is going to be the stronger trait that gets passed down to the child. So this one will show the dominant trait, which in this case is a purple or violet flower. But then when you save the seeds from this flower or plant here, then some of them are going to show one of the parents' colors, and some of them are going to show the dominant color. So you're going to have the dominant color showing as well as the recessive or the less strong color showing. And so here, for example, if you grew out 1,000, then about 700 or about 3/4 would be matched to the purple or dominant parent, and about 1/4 of them would be matched to the recessive or less strong genetic characteristic. So when we're saving seeds from our plants, if we don't know anything about the parents, the fruit is going to match the parents. Another example in the garden is an early girl tomato. An early girl is a cross between two parents. One of them is for the characteristics of the skin, and one of them is for the characteristics of the taste of the fruit. And what we get is this, what would be an F1 or first filial, you'll see this here, fruit that we call the early girl. When we grow the seeds from the early girl, Some of the seeds might produce a plant that has the fruit characteristics of one parent, and some of the seeds may have the skin characteristics of the other parent. Sometimes it's not very noticeable. Here you have a purple flower and a white flower. Obviously, one is purple and one is white. But a lot of people who grow seeds from early girl plants say it tastes an awful lot like this mixed parent of. So the first thing to know is, do you know the parents? And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. The next thing is a question for yourself, or thing to consider is, did you grow it yourself, or was it grown in a home or community garden? Here we have Master Gardener Lynn, and they have these amazing mega squashes which survived, or yeah, squashes, I don't think they're gourds, that survived a whole summer at a community garden not being tended to. And they made like 15 pounds of squash meat in that fruit right there. And so these were these amazing things that they were just sort of growing kind of wild. And I think they're now on the fifth year of growing out these squashes and sharing them with the community. And so in this case, they sort of know the history, that whether there was any control of pollination or any monitoring, were there other squashes nearby of different varieties, so that you might end up with this crossbreeding of two different types. So that's another thing to consider. Another thing to consider is if you bought it at the store, and do you know anything? Or do you even have, when it's grown at home or in a community garden, you have an opportunity to find out something about its parentage. But when you buy it at the store, then oftentimes you do not have any information about the parentage. This is a photograph from the Heirloom Festival that they do up in Santa Rosa, where they make a big tower of squash. And so these are not all bought. None of them are probably grown at the store. And then they're donated after the event. But it's a pretty impressive squash tower if you ever have an opportunity to go. And then the last thing to consider before we'll dive into those a little bit more is, do you really care about, if you save a seed, does the success of that seed really matter deeply to you? So I like to think about, this is from the same Heirloom Festival, and they grow the mega pumpkins or squashes. And these people care very deeply about these. These are a certain variety, not all squash, not any squash can just become giant. There's certain varieties that can become giant. And when they're setting out to grow the most giant squash ever, then, or pumpkin, or squash, I guess they are, ever, then they care deeply about making sure that it has the genetics, because they've allotted the space and they put a lot of energy and time into this. And so they wouldn't want to take a chance and just grow any squash. They really care that that squash is going to be what you expect. Another reason you might really care is you only have a small space to garden in. And when you put that squash seed, you know, say for example, you're doing a square foot garden and you've allotted one slot, which would be several square feet for the squash, and you're really only growing a couple plants, and those plants kind of need to be successful because you don't have a lot of them growing. It may be a situation where, you know, not a lot of us in the United States are, well, I shouldn't say that. You know, some people are dependent on the food that they grow, and squash provides a great amount of food. When you look at the squash that Lynn grew here, you know, this was like 15 pounds of squash meat, and definitely provided food and sustenance for the families that received those. So that may be another time when you really care what you're growing and you don't want to take a chance. So, all right, so do you know the parentage? If yes, then you want to know if it's hybrid, and is it something that's open pollinated? If no, then you go back to sort of the bottom one, and do you really care? And so we'll talk about that in just a second. If you grew it at home, again, do you know the parentage of the seeds? Were they given to you by somebody in a community garden or a gardening group, and you don't really know the parentage of the seeds? Do you know if the pollination was controlled? Is it something like I've done several times, where I've bought pumpkins at the store and just thrown the seeds into the compost pile and they sprout? or I have the little tiny pumpkins and I want to see if I can regrow those. And so in that case, you really don't know anything about the parents. And so then the question is with the information you know and don't know, or know that you don't know, then do you want to proceed anyway? And I don't think there's anything wrong with saving seeds from plants where you don't know the history or the parentage. You just know that you don't know what you're going to get. So with things like with certain fruits, when they're crossbred, maybe some of them are crossbred for disease resistance or hardiness to hot temperatures or cool temperatures, or they can tolerate shade. And so some of those ones that are bred for disease resistance, there's other fruits that are bred for color. And some of those seeds, they just may not, they'll grow a plant and they may grow a fruit. It just may not be very palatable or very good. So, if you don't care about that, then not knowing the parentage or not knowing whether they're hybrid or just saving seeds from the store, there's nothing wrong with any of that. So just because we want to know those things, it doesn't mean not knowing them will stop you. One of the things that happened with this seed, this squash that they've been growing for 5 years, is Tim and Lynn Summers are both master gardeners, and they do a lot of research. And so they didn't know anything. They didn't know the name. They didn't know what type it was. So they spent quite a bit of time researching and figuring out what kind of squash it was. But because they don't know the parentage, they'll never know for sure. But did it really matter? Not really. They continued to grow it. I think, again, they're on their 5th season. And so this is a sort of now become, as they've regrown it in the Inland Empire, it's become an Inland Empire unique variety. And it may have a very common parentage. It may have something really unique. Nobody knows. And it didn't really matter. It produced fruit. And that was fine with them. So again, I think the only time where not knowing the parentage or buying something at the store and not knowing is it a hybrid, is just if you have the outcome really matters to you. If you're trying to grow the world's largest squash, if you're trying to provide food for your family, if you have a really small space and you don't want to take any chances, then I would say you probably want to purchase seeds that are open pollinated, or get seeds from someone like, again, going back to Tim and Lynn. They've grown those out for 5 years. They're relatively experienced seed savers. And when I get seeds from them and they say this will breed true, then most likely they've done the work needed to get that to happen. Okay. So is there any questions about knowing the parentage or having that? I always call myself an accidental seed saver. I come across seeds and I save them, and then I grow them out and I see what happens. And my success rate, I would say, is about 50%, because I don't know any of that back history. And one day when I get older and have more time, when I grow up, then maybe I'll be more proactive and really know what I'm doing and saving. But for now, I'm fine with just experimenting and playing around with it. So as long as you're fine with that, then you don't have to let not knowing any of these things listed stop you. Okay. Any questions before I go on? Okay, and if you're typing something in the chat, I'm happy to stop and check in on that. So something just to note, which makes winter squash and pumpkins much easier to seed save from than your summer squash, is that summer squash is harvested and eaten when it's immature. So it's a little bit hard to see in this photo, but the little spots here around this squash, those are the immature seeds. And when this squash is fully mature, the skin is hard and the inside is very fibrous. And this is not a variety of squash that we like to eat when it's mature. So summer squash, you have to leave it on the vine and let it ripen past maturity. And so that makes it a little bit harder for the timing. If you harvest all of your squash and it turns out it was the best squash ever and you don't get any more fruit, then you missed your opportunity. And so that is something that's not true of winter squash. Was there a question or? Okay. So with winter squash and pumpkins, then these are eaten and harvested when the fruit is fully mature. So the summer squash seed saving, like I said, you need to leave the fruits on the vine past their best eating size and allow the seeds to fully mature. For the when, like I said, when the summer squash and also cucumbers are edible and eggplants as well, then the seeds are not viable. But melons and winter squash are harvested when they're fully mature. So the stem has started to dry out and the seeds have fully matured inside. So when you're harvesting those, the seeds are ready to go, and it makes it one of the plants that's easier to seed save from. If you think about, for example, broccoli, you have to let the flower head go completely to seed and you lose the flower head. And unless you're eating the leaves or the stems of the broccoli, then for the most part, you lose the opportunity to eat that broccoli when you want to seed save from that particular plant. But with melons and winter squash, you get the bonus of having the seeds nicely packaged inside. They're very easy to clean, and you can eat the fruit, the flesh of the plant. And the seeds is what the other thing that's nice is that the seeds will sit inside of the pumpkin or winter squash for a long time. So most of the pumpkins that we get at Halloween time are actually grown earlier and harvested and kept in a cool, dry place. So, so there was a question in the chat, and it says, with summer squash, do you leave the plant on till it falls off the vine to save the seeds? So there's probably a little bit of variety depending, but I know for eggplant and for summer squash, you want to harvest it when you sort of like can poke it with your nail and it's tender. When it starts to become tough and the vine starts to dry is probably when it's mature. You probably don't need to wait till it completely falls off the vine. It's probably mature a little bit before that. But basically, yeah, you're going to wait until it starts to dry on the vine. Sometimes you might want to play around with it a little bit depending on your environment. Because I've noticed sometimes when you leave summer squash on the vine, sometimes it can start to rot depending on where it's sitting. So the seeds, you probably want to play, if there's a few types of squash, summer squash or eggplants, or cucumbers that you really like to eat, then I suggest if you get a good crop one year, playing around with it, and as the vine starts to dry, then harvesting one and seeing if the seeds are hard inside. When I was first learning about seed saving, it's so funny, just like everything, when you can read about it and you can see pictures, but then there's out in the field and actually doing it. And it's like, oh, is this seed mature or not? And the best way for me to tell if seeds were mature was just to think back to what they look like in the package. The coating of the seed is hard and fully formed. And so I would try to leave them on as long as possible. If you're having problems with rot, you may want to put them on like a cardboard or lift them up a little bit. But they mature pretty quickly. And so, yeah, once the skin is sort of rubbery and tough, and the vine starts to dry, that's when the seeds for your summer squash, your cucumbers, and like your eggplants will be mature. Some of the varieties, there may be just a little bit of a difference. So like with all things about seed saving, it just takes practice over time. But basically, in a nutshell, then yeah, that's when your summer squash are going to be ready. And so like the pumpkins, they're harvested a lot of times in August and September for October and Halloween because it's easier to get the plant started when it's a little bit cooler. The timing for pumpkins to be ready at Halloween is planting, like mid-July to early August. And that can be a really hard time to grow in Southern California, hard time to get the plant started. So a lot of times what they'll do is they'll start them a little bit earlier. They'll harvest them and store them in a cool, dry place. And until those seeds sprout inside, then the seeds can sort of be stored in there. So like I'll take the things that I buy in the early fall from the nurseries, or sorry, from like grocery stores for decorations, then in January I'll put them out. I actually have one. Do I have? I have one left from last year's fall that still hasn't decomposed at all. And usually when those open up and decompose, the seeds are just fine, just sitting inside. They haven't sprouted, they haven't rotted. So I really like that about seed saving from melons and squash. And so the next thing to think about is, so you want to make sure they're mature, which with your winter pumpkin, with your winter squash and your pumpkins, they're mature when they're harvested. So you can check that box. And then the next thing is going back that step and thinking about pollination. So the nice thing is that there's basically 4 different species of cucurbits that we grow at home. And those are winter squash, summer squash, gourd, and pumpkins. And those generally do not cross-pollinate. So for example, like a loofah and a pumpkin generally do not cross-pollinate. They're different species, and that usually is not an issue. But if you are growing, for example, 5 different types of gourds or 5 different types of summer squash, then it is possible for them to cross-pollinate. And one of the ways to prevent cross-pollination is in not having the flowers be physically close. And we're going to look at a chart in just a moment, and I'll talk about that. But the other way is just to prevent them from blooming at the same time, or to do hand pollinating. And we'll talk about that in just a second. And then the other question is, do you have active pollinators in your yard? And so a lot of times if you have poor squash or pumpkin production, it can be due to lack of pollinators. And if the fruit is not pollinated, the fruit simply drops off. So you're not going to have a case. I tried to do a little bit more research on this, and I'm going to continue to research this. But I was trying to look up if it was possible to get an unpollinated squash or pumpkin or melon, because pollination is key to fruit set, which means if the fruit has set, there must be pollinated seeds inside. So I was getting kind of down that rabbit hole to look up cases where fruit set, but there was not viable seeds inside. So like, for example, you can have citrus fruits where the fruit develops, but the seeds inside are not viable. And so I need to do more research. I feel like I can't say anything more about that in an educated way. So I'm going to do more research on that. But one of the reasons you have fruit blossom or drop is if there's lack of pollination. So if you do get a fruit pollinated, most likely it's going to have a viable seed inside, unless it has some kind of disease that interrupts that process. So with your squashes and your pumpkins and all of those in the cucurbit family, you have male and female flowers. Here's the male flower on the left, and that one's going to show up first. Usually on average, it depends on exactly what you're growing, but usually on average about 2 weeks before the female flowers start showing up, you'll get these male flowers. And so you can see this is the ovule here on the female flower, and this is the immature fruit. And so on a cucumber, it will be sort of like a little fuzzy skinny thing because it's the immature cucumber. And so the males will show up. It will just be a flower with nothing, no swelling down here at the bottom. And these will drop off because they're not ever going to make fruit. What you should be concerned about, or is sort of a red flag that you may not have enough pollinators in your yard, or you may need to do hand pollinating, is if you see flowers like this and they drop off, it's because they did not get pollinated. Hand pollination of squash and pumpkins is really easy. What you do is you would take your male flowers that you can identify because they don't have anything down here, and you can cut off, for example, the petals or pull back the petals. So here on the left is a male flower, again, identified by the lack of swelling down here below the flower. And you just simply put the pollen here on the female flower. Again, you know it's the female flower because it has this swelling down here. Okay, so if you're seeing a lot of drop of flowers that look like this, then those are the male flowers, and especially early on, that shouldn't be anything to worry about. If you're seeing a lot of drop of these kind of flowers, then one, you're not going to get fruit, so that's kind of a bummer because you're hoping to eat your squashes or do something with your gourds or have pumpkins or whatever. But these are the ones that you are going to want to watch that these are not falling off. Okay. Once you've hand pollinated a flower, then there's a couple different things you can do in relation to seed saving. If you weren't seed saving, you don't need to do anything. You can just watch the plant grow. There's two things you can do with seed saving. If you're growing a lot of squash, if you're only growing one squash and you don't think your neighbors are growing a lot of squash, you're not in a community garden where there may be cross-pollination. Because remember, going back to what we talked about at the beginning with cross-pollination, you may get some hybridizing. Maybe the hybridizing will create something new and wonderful, but if you are in a situation where you want to know exactly what you're growing, then you may not want them to cross-pollinate. And once you've hand-pollinated your flower, because that's kind of the only way to really know the parents, right? Then you can take a loose string and tie the end of the flower, or you can get like a gauze bag and you can cover the flower. You want to prevent pollinators from coming in and doing any more pollination. The other thing, if you're going to seed save, is I recommend, because remember that this flower is going to fall off, that you can take a string and at the base near the fruit, you can just tie a little string to remind you that this is the fruit that you hand pollinated for seed saving. Okay. So again, if you're just growing fruit, you don't need to do any of this. If you want to grow fruit with seeds inside where you know something about the parents, or maybe you don't want to, maybe you're only growing one kind of squash and you're not really concerned about the parents, but you know that pollination is low and you want to see how successful you are at hand pollination. And that could be either for eating the fruit or eating the fruit and saving the seeds. Then you can hand pollinate and either tie off the flower. Now, if you're just trying to make sure that you get fruit, because a lot of times with squash, we'll recommend if you're not getting fruit production, that you hand pollinate. And so if you're just trying to get squash or you're just trying to get pumpkins or whatever you're trying to grow in the cucurbit family, then you don't need to tie it off. The purpose of tying it off is to prevent other little bees from coming in and bringing more pollen. So if you're not trying to save seeds, you don't really care. As long as it's got pollinated the first time, you don't care if it gets pollinated 5 more times if you're just eating the fruit, because remember, the fruit is going to match the plant. Okay. So all of this isolating the flower is in relation to seed saving. And are you going to keep the pollen from other plants? Or maybe you're crossbreeding. Maybe you have 2 squashes that you really love the color of one and the flavor of the other. Maybe you're going to take those 2 squashes that are varieties within the same species and you're going to cross-pollinate them. And maybe this one is saved because you've cross-pollinated it. So in that case, you're going to want to, again, make sure you mark the base of the fruit, since the flower and all of this will fall off. And you think you're going to remember where this little squash is. But as it gets bigger, it is going to move around and it's going to maybe have others that appear and you might not know which one this is. And so make sure you tie them. But for example, you could say on one squash plant, maybe you have like 3 different kinds of squash you're growing. And one of the squash plants you want to seed save from. And maybe you hand pollinate with male and female flowers from the same squash plant, and you tie those up with like a red ribbon. And then maybe on one of the flowers, you cross-pollinate it with a squash that's over here, and you bring that pollen in, and maybe you tie that one with like a blue ribbon. And so that one will be one that you intentionally crossbred. Maybe it will be junk. Maybe it will be the best thing ever and the next pumpkin that will take over the world. Who knows? But so there's just some suggestions on how you can control that. You guys have any questions about that? And you can just be like me, which is like, oh, who are the parents? Who knows? I've got no idea. Here's some seeds in front of me. I'm going to save them and I'm going to try to grow them. And I get about 50% success. A lot of them never make fruit. They make plants, but they never make fruit. So we saved our seeds. Now what? Well, not saved our seeds. We've grown our plant. Now what? We're going to wait. And we're going to harvest when the vine starts to dry out. So you can see with all of these squash, this is also from the Heirloom Festival. I'm not endorsing them as a master gardener. It's just a really fun, cool place to go that I've enjoyed myself. You see that all of the squash or cucurbit, all of these, they're all dried. The stem is dried. So this would be your pumpkins and everything in between, or like the question in the chat earlier, if you were saving your summer squash or your cucumbers or your eggplants, you want that drying to begin. And then you harvest the seeds. This is a fun activity I do with, I used to do with the garden class I used to teach at my kids' school. And we get all different kinds of gourds and pumpkins and squash from the local grocery store that has a big variety, and we break them open to see. It's so fascinating to see the different thickness of the flesh, the different color of the seeds. Some of the little pumpkins have really big seeds. Some of the big pumpkins have really little seeds. Really cool. So this is the harvesting process. You break them open, you clean them out. You will end up here smashing them so we can look inside. And these little tiny pumpkins have really big seeds. It's super fun. And this you get these seeds, and each one of these little tendrils is how that seed connected to the mother fruit. So if you sort of look back here, all the little string or pulp, each one of these is connected to a seed and fed that seed so that the seed could become viable and grow and do what it needed to do. And so that's what we want to clean off of our pumpkins, okay? So we want to remove, the goal is to remove any organic matter. Like I said, each seed is connected to the fruit, and that connection needs to be washed off. For some of them, you can soak them for a few hours, but usually you just need to submerge them in water and massage them gently. If you soak them, don't want to soak them too long. I would say no more than, it depends on the type of seed, but basically if you soak them too long, it will wake the seed up and it will start to germinate. And the reason we want to remove all of this material is going to promote mold and fungus to grow in our saved seeds. So always the question is, why are we saving the seeds? Well, if you have a winter squash where you harvest the seeds in October, November, or December, if you grow those plants, the day is too short and they're not going to probably make it through our coldest time of the year in February. So it is obvious, but we're saving the seeds to plant them at the right time. Maybe we're saving the seeds to share them with the community or to build up a seed supply of that plant in the community. And so we're kind of putting those seeds on hold. And the best way to put them on hold is to have them free of organic matter. So with seeds that we call wet seeds, like tomato seeds or cucumbers or squash or raspberry or whatever, anything that has organic material on the outside, we want to clean that so it doesn't invite mold and fungus in. And then we want to store them in a cool, dry place. It's really simple. And cool, dry place, it could be anywhere in your house that is cool and is dry. Some people have asked about storing seeds in the freezer. And the only problem with storing seeds in the freezer is that if there's a lot of moisture in the seeds, as the moisture freezes and it expands, it can crack and corrupt the seed. People ask about storing seeds in refrigerators, and I kind of discourage it just because there's a few things you could put in your refrigerator which may impact your seeds. Different fruits release different chemicals that may impact your seeds, and then there's also different moisture levels in the refrigerator. So I just store them in a box in a cool, dry place in the house. You can add silica packets. The main thing that I've had issues with, and other seed savers I know have issues with, is probably pests more than temperature and moisture. We live in Southern California. It's very dry. We don't have a lot of humidity. So, but it's moths and mice and little critters. So just making sure that they can't be attacked by pests, but it doesn't need to be airtight. I use a kind of a loose Tupperware lid where bugs and critters can't get in, but where it's not airtight. And the key is that you want these seeds to be snappable, is the word I like to use. You want them to dry out. So to go from this, these seeds are very pliable. They're very flexible. They've been inside of the fruit. They're very soft, most of them. And so the trick to saving and dry them is to wash them, number one, to get that organic matter off. And then number two, let them sit out and dry so that they are like they come from a seed packet. So usually, with these, some of them are hard and you can actually hurt your finger trying to snap them, but you want the moisture to be gone. Usually it takes a couple days to a few weeks, depending on the temperature we're having, but don't put them into any packaging or any storage until they are fully dry. So again, the process super simple. You're going to take them out of the pumpkin or squash. You're going to wash off the material. Maybe you need to massage them gently, maybe soak them for a little bit. I think I forgot to mention, don't let them dry out with that organic matter on them, because then removing the organic matter later is so hard. So if you're not going to get to them right away, maybe an hour or two, put them in a little bit of water or cover them with like a damp paper towel. Once this fleshy material dries onto the seeds, like some of these come out, like this is some sort of butternut type squash. These come out actually pretty clean, but some of them can be quite messy. And this stuff, once it's dried, it is very hard to remove it. And that's where you may need to do a little bit of soaking. And then I also want to mention that for home gardeners, sterile seeds, I don't think are really the goal. If you're in some sort of project where you're saving seeds in a seed bank where they're in stasis and sterility may be important, then that's one thing. But there's a lot of research that's emerging that shows that there's a lot of beneficial organisms that actually help keep the seeds and young plants healthy. So we want to wash off this organic material, but we don't want to sterilize these things. That's not the goal. Okay, so no need to do anything beyond just removing most of this organic. Okay, so with that, I want to share with you, I'm going to drop in the chat. We have some resources, and I'll talk about those in just a second. I encourage you to check out our website. We've got all of our classes posted through the rest of the year, and we'll add our January classes next month. You can sign up for our newsletter, follow us on social media, and you can always reach out to our Master Gardener helpline and call, or better yet, email and send us pictures of all of your plant questions. So with that, I'm going to drop these resources in the chat. There's one from our UC Integrated Pest Management site on taking care of pumpkins, and another one on taking care of squash. And so that talks about how to plant it, how to grow it, and everything in between, and how to manage the pests and all of those things. And then I cite several times the Seed Savers Exchange. And this resource is great. There is one on seed saving squash, and there is another one on distances. And I want to show you guys this chart real fast. While I jump over to that screen, are there any questions? I'm just about done, but are there any questions? Okay, I'm not seeing any. If you're typing in the chat, then that's fine, and we'll get to that. Let me show you this chart really fast. Normally, we like to share information from the University of California, but when it comes to seed saving, a lot of the information is on a crop by crop basis and not really targeted for the homeowner, but more targeted for the commercial aspect. So this Seed Savers Exchange, I'm not endorsing them as a master gardener, have some really great information on seed saving. So the seed saving chart, here is some information about the different columns of the chart. And so I've had to refer back to this several times because I forget, and it took me a while to sort of internalize all of this. So you see the bold-faced or the larger words are the different columns. And then I'm going to show you the chart itself, and we're going to go to pumpkins. And they have lots of other information. They also have information on seed saving for pumpkins as well, and squash. So here's the chart. So let's go down. Let's see, I'm pretty sure they have pumpkins. They have gourds. Okay, so here's pumpkins. Let's see if I can make my screen a little larger. I kind of lose part of the chart, so I'm going to make it a little smaller. Okay, so here is pumpkins. It tells you which family it's in. or let's see, what is it? A species. It tells you the species and then the family that it's in. That's important because they can crossbreed with plants in their same family, some of them more easily than others. So remember I mentioned that you have gourds and you have winter squash and you have pumpkins and summer squash. Those ones, if we go back up here to gourds, let's see, it starts with a G, gotta slow down. There we go, gourds. Oh, okay, gourds. So you see it's in the same family, but it's a different species. These are the hard-shelled gourds. The soft-shelled gourds are in the same family and also the same species, I believe, as pumpkins and squash. So they may crossbreed a little bit more easily. The part here that says annual for pumpkins tells you that it grows in one season. The pollination method is insect, or it might be us. This information says, so if you're growing, gosh, I don't know the common names of any, like Cinderella pumpkin, I think that's the thing. So if you're growing a Cinderella pumpkin and you have a different variety that's the same species and same family as, well, it's obviously the same family, but same species as a Cinderella pumpkin, then it's possible that those plants, if you have a lot of pollinators, can crossbreed if they're within 800 feet of each other. You only need one, so you only need to grow one plant to get viable seeds. And then here, this information on the side talks about more if you're getting deeper into seed saving. So what you need to know from this chart is that it will make its fruit and seeds within 1 year. Onions or parsnips or parsley, those take 2 seasons. It's not quite 2 years, but 2 seasons to make seeds. So, you know, pumpkins will make their seeds in the first year. You know, it's insect pollinated, and that if a lot of people are growing a lot of different kinds of pumpkins near you, your plant may get hybridized without you realizing it. The onion, you'll see for how many you need to have viable seeds, you need 5. So you need several onions to grow to have viable seeds, but with pumpkins, you just need 1. If we go down here to squash, and I'm almost done, it's 11:30. If you need to go, thanks so much for joining us. So you see squash is similar, winter and summer squash, that it's insect pollinated and you only need 1. So this is a chart that I've had to learn to use as a tool for seed saving, but this is the site that I recommend you go to as you're learning more about the crossbreeding and what type of pollination, what family is it in. You can see that we have a really extensive list of plants here. I think it's 5 pages. So as you do more seed saving outside of the squash and pumpkin family, then this can be a go-to resource for you. So with that, I think that's it for me. And I thank you so much for joining. And we look forward to having you join our next seed saving class in December. Will be about the basics of seed saving. So we'll sort of take it back to the basics for next month's class. And happy gardening and happy seed saving, everyone.